The morning sun glimmered over Atlanta's skyline as a new day broke through the steel-gray clouds. The city was alive with energy, its streets teeming with commuters and the low hum of car engines weaving through the winding highways. It was a typical morning for the bustling city, but within the walls of the First Redeemer Church, the quiet was only the calm before a storm that would soon shatter the peace. Pastor Jeremiah Wells stood by the large window of his office, staring out at the church grounds. The pristine lawns stretched before him, the towering steeple reaching toward the heavens. He had spent the last 20 years cultivating this image of calm, of a perfect, God-fearing life. He had built a reputation as a man of unwavering faith and dedication, beloved by his congregation. His sermons, filled with words of forgiveness, grace, and compassion, had won the hearts of many. But as he stood there, his mind was far from holy thoughts. Instead, his thoughts spiraled into a whirlpool of rage, betrayal, and confusion. Jeremiah's phone rang, its shrill tone piercing the stillness of his office. With a hesitant hand, he picked it up, already knowing who it was on the other end. It was Mike Henderson, his trusted deacon and longtime friend. Mike's voice came through, strained and urgent. "Pastor, we've got a problem, a big one. You need to come down here, now." Jeremiah's heart skipped a beat. He knew something was terribly wrong. "What is it, Mike?" His voice was controlled, but there was a tightness in it that betrayed his growing unease. "It's Paul," Mike said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I found him in bed with Ann." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Paul Jackson, one of the most devoted members of the church, caught in bed with his wife, Ann. His wife, the woman he had loved for over 20 years. The woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin, who had shared the highs and lows of his ministry. How could this happen? Jeremiah felt the blood drain from his face as he gripped the edge of his desk for support. "I need you to come down here right now," Mike continued, his voice pleading. "You've got to see this. You've got to take care of this." Jeremiah's world suddenly felt unmoored. His mind raced, the image of Paul and Ann together in the most intimate way flashing through his mind like a nightmare. But his reaction was not one of shock or grief. It was anger, a burning, white-hot rage that surged through him. He knew that Mike was right. This was his mess to handle. "I'll be there," Jeremiah replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion brewing inside. He hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, his chest heaving with each breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had never felt this betrayed in his life. Not by a member of his congregation, not by the one person he thought he could trust above all else. Jeremiah paced the room, his mind already beginning to form a plan. He was a man of God, yes, but he was also a man of power, of control. No one ever questioned his authority, and this betrayal, this affront to everything he had built, was something he could not, would not allow to go unanswered. The clock on his office wall ticked louder now, each second passing like a drumbeat in his ears. He walked to his desk and picked up a piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly. It was a note Ann had written to him the previous week, a note full of love and devotion. How hollow those words now felt. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Mike. "We can't let anyone else find out. This needs to be handled discreetly." Discreetly, of course. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about maintaining control. Jeremiah Wells's reputation, his life's work, had been built on a foundation of respect and authority. This had to be handled with precision. There would be no scandal. There would be no public disgrace, not while he had any say in the matter. He picked up his coat, slipping it over his shoulders. His steps were deliberate as he made his way to his car. As he drove through the city streets, he focused on nothing but the task at hand. His thoughts were like a distant hum, muffled beneath the raw pulse of anger and shame. He arrived at the church's auxiliary building, the one where Mike had arranged to meet him. The building was old, its brick walls weathered with time. Jeremiah felt his pulse quicken as he approached the door. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. But the moment he stepped inside, he was greeted by an unsettling silence. Mike was waiting for him in the back room. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he paced nervously. "What happened?" Jeremiah's voice was low, controlled. but his eyes were sharp, like a hawk searching for prey. "Pastor," Mike said, swallowing hard, "I confronted him. Paul was in your office. He was still in bed with Anne. When I walked in, he didn't even try to deny it. He just stared at me. Like he didn't care." Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced with thoughts of what he should do. His grip tightened around the edge of the wooden table before him. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice a whisper of cold fury. Mike hesitated before answering. I, well, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I restrained him. He's locked in your office. He's still there." Jeremiah's face darkened. "You restrained him?" His voice was a sharp command. "And you didn't think to call the police?" Mike shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want this to get out. We can't have this kind of scandal ruining the church. I thought maybe you would know better how to handle this." Jeremiah's thoughts swirled as he processed Mike's words. This was no longer about saving his marriage. This was about power, about maintaining control over the chaos that had erupted around him. He couldn't afford to let Paul Jackson destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. "I'll handle it," Jeremiah finally said, his voice cold and steady. "You stay here. Don't let anyone else know about this." Mike nodded, relief washing over him. But in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. What Jeremiah Wells was about to do would change everything. The rage burning inside the pastor was too great to contain, and the consequences of that rage would soon be felt by everyone around him. As Jeremiah made his way to his office, he knew there was no turning back. He was about to confront Paul Jackson, but what would happen after that was uncertain. One thing was clear: his perfect world, built on faith and the image of righteousness, was about to come crashing down. And when the dust settled, the truth would come to light. But would it be the truth anyone could bear? The air inside the First Redeemer Church felt heavy with secrets. The scent of polished wood and old hymnals clung to the walls, masking the bloodshed that had recently stained its sacred floors. Detective Lana Ross had seen her fair share of crime scenes, but nothing quite like this. The brutal disfigurement of Paul Jackson was unsettling, not just in its violence, but in the profound betrayal it signified. The pastor Jeremiah Wells had been arrested, but Lana knew that the truth was often hidden beneath layers of pride, shame, and fear. And this particular case, had those layers in spades. It had only been hours since she'd spoken with Wells, but already she felt like the investigation was veering off in a dozen directions. His claim that Paul Jackson had been caught in bed with his wife, Anne, seemed to hold the key. But something about Wells's demeanor bothered Lana. He was too calm, too controlled. When she'd pressed him for more details, he had offered little beyond vague allusions to betrayal and a broken marriage. That, she knew, was not enough. As she left the holding room, Lana turned to Officer Jameson, who had been stationed nearby, awaiting her next move. "Get me everything you can on Ann Wells," she said firmly. "I need to know her history with Paul Jackson, their interactions, anything that might explain how we got to this point." Jameson nodded. "Already on it, Detective. I'll have the files for you in an hour." Lana gave him a curt nod and made her way out of the church. The detective was keenly aware that she needed to act quickly. Pastor Wells was being tight-lipped, and if she didn't dig deeper, the investigation would remain stuck in a cycle of speculation and half-truths. She needed to find a tangible lead, something concrete that would provide the missing pieces to the puzzle. Back at the station, Lana spread the files across her desk. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples, trying to piece everything together. The initial report on Paul Jackson was typical, nothing out of the ordinary. A man in his mid-30s, married with 2 young children. He was a dedicated churchgoer, involved in youth programs, and a well-respected member of the community. There had been no signs of trouble in his life until now. Lana's eyes moved to the next file, Ann Wells. She quickly skimmed through the papers, looking for any red flags. Ann was 42, married to Pastor Jeremiah Wells for over 20 years. They had 3 children, all of whom were involved in church activities. On the surface, everything looked normal. Ann was described as loving, patient, and committed to her family. But there were small details that stuck out. There had been a few reports over the years of her having private conversations with Paul Jackson. Nothing incriminating, just the occasional exchange of words in the church courtyard or after services. But there were also a few unsettling remarks made by Anne's close friends, who claimed that she seemed distant, withdrawn in recent months. Lana couldn't help but wonder if there was something more beneath the surface. She quickly pulled up the details of Anne's most recent meetings with Paul. They had been seen talking alone at church events multiple times, and there were whispers about their closeness, but nothing concrete, at least nothing that could be tied to an affair. But the absence of concrete evidence didn't mean much. People rarely saw affairs happening right under their noses. Then there was the matter of Anne's relationship with her husband. From the outside, it seemed perfect. Jeremiah Wells, the charismatic pastor, and his doting wife. The couple appeared to be the epitome of a successful church family. But after a long night of digging through church records, interviews, and witness statements, Lana found something interesting. Something that hadn't been in the initial reports. There were subtle signs of strain between Anne and her husband. A couple of friends had commented that Anne had seemed less enthusiastic about church activities in recent months. The couple had also attended marriage counseling briefly, but the records indicated they had stopped after only a few sessions. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Lana wonder if there had been something simmering beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. She looked at the clock. It had been several hours since she left the church, and she knew it was time to pay Ann Wells a visit. The deeper she delved into this case, the more questions arose. Why would a man of God like Jeremiah Wells be driven to commit such an act of violence? What had driven him to that office, to the moment when Paul Jackson was murdered? As Lana grabbed her coat and headed out the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from a simple case of infidelity. No, this was something more complex, something darker. Ann Wells' home was quiet. The suburban neighborhood where she and her family lived was well kept, with manicured lawns and houses that looked identical to each other, all in neat rows. The serenity of the neighborhood felt at odds with the violent chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Lana rang the doorbell, her mind racing with questions. The door opened slowly, revealing Ann Wells standing in the doorway. Her eyes were puffy, as though she had been crying for hours. She looked worn out, drained. Despite her frazzled appearance, Lana could see the unmistakable sense of composure that came with being a pastor's wife. Anne was used to the public eye, used to maintaining her dignity, even in the hardest of circumstances. "Detective Ross," Anne said softly, her voice thick with grief. "I wasn't expecting anyone." Lana gave a polite smile, though she could see the pain in Anne's eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Wells, but I need to ask you a few questions about your husband and Paul Jackson." Anne's eyes widened, and her hand gripped the doorframe tightly. "Paul, my husband, what's happened to him? Is he all right?" Her voice quivered. "Can I come inside?" Lana asked, her tone gentle but firm. Anne nodded, stepping back to allow Lana entry. The house smelled of lavender and faintly of coffee. A quiet house with no children in sight. They passed through a living room decorated with family photos, the kind of place you could tell had been lovingly curated. Everything seemed ordinary, except it wasn't. Once they were seated in the living room, Anne looked at Lana, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "What happened?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. Why would my husband do something like this? He's a man of God. He would never—" Her voice cracked. Lana took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "We believe your husband was involved in Paul Jackson's death. I know this must be incredibly difficult, but I need you to be honest with me. I need to understand what happened between your husband, you and Paul." Anne's face went pale. "Paul and I?" Her voice was almost a gasp. "What are you implying, Detective?" Lana watched her closely. "I'm not implying anything, but the evidence suggests that there may have been something between you and Paul Jackson. Can you tell me about your relationship with him?" Anne's hands trembled as she clutched a tissue in her lap. "Paul was just a friend. He was close to our family. I can't believe this is happening. I've been so worried about my husband. He's changed. He's not the same man he used to be." Lana leaned forward, pressing gently. And what about you, Mrs. Wells? Were you close to Paul? Anne's lips trembled as she took a deep breath. I, I don't know what to say. There was nothing inappropriate. But Jeremiah, he's been distant lately. We've been through a lot. I thought it was just stress from the church. But maybe it was more. Maybe he saw something between me and Paul that wasn't there. He's been so angry, I didn't know how to reach him. I didn't know what to do. Lana's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Jeremiah Wells, a man consumed with anger and jealousy, had found the one thing that could break him, the belief that his wife had betrayed him. His reaction had been violent, driven by a distorted sense of righteousness and rage, and Paul Jackson had paid the price. But there was something more, something that wasn't sitting right with Lana. She could sense it in Anne's voice, in the way she avoided certain details. There was more to this story, more than just a pastor caught in a web of jealousy and rage. The question was, what was Anne hiding? As Lana stood to leave, she glanced one more time at Anne, who had barely spoken since her last confession. "I'll be in touch," Lana said softly. But she wasn't sure if Anne was telling the whole truth, or if she was simply too afraid to. The case was getting murkier by the second, and Lana knew she needed to dig deeper. Somewhere buried in the fractured pieces of this story was the truth, and she would uncover it, no matter how far she had to go. The rain had started falling as Lana drove back to the station. The steady patter against the windshield only seemed to deepen her sense of unease. Each drop smudged the clarity of her thoughts, blurring the picture she was beginning to form of this twisted case. As much as she wanted to believe that Jeremiah Wells was the sole perpetrator, something in her gut told her this was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Anne Wells had been shaken, but there was something about her story that didn't sit right with Lana. She'd seemed too eager to downplay her interactions with Paul Jackson, too quick to distance herself from any responsibility. But that wasn't all. The subtle shift in Anne's tone when Lana mentioned Paul's name, the slight hesitation, had been enough to raise a red flag. She hadn't been entirely forthcoming. Lana could feel the layers of this investigation shifting under her feet, like trying to walk on quicksand. The more she dug into Anne's past, the more inconsistencies she found. She knew she needed to focus on every small detail. Each piece of evidence, no matter how insignificant it seemed, could provide the breakthrough she needed to unravel the truth. Back at the precinct, Lana sat at her desk, the files spread in front of her. She wasn't one to overlook the small things. While Officer Jameson had gathered more information on Anne Wells, she had gone back to review the details of the church's surveillance footage. There was a small security camera near the back of the church office, and though it didn't capture the gruesome events that had taken place inside, it did reveal something important. The footage had shown Anne leaving the church late the night before Paul Jackson's body had been discovered. She had been alone, walking to her car with a look of hurried urgency in her step. It wasn't enough to imply guilt, but it was enough to spark suspicion. Why had she been there so late, and why hadn't she mentioned it? Lana leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The pieces were starting to come together, just not in the way she had anticipated. She needed to know more about what happened between Paul and Anne, and she needed to hear it straight from someone who might have been close to the situation. Her phone buzzed. It was Officer Jameson. "Detective, I've got some additional info on Anne," he said. "Seems there's more to this than we thought. I've got her medical records, as well as some of her private counseling sessions with Paul." Lana's pulse quickened. "You've been able to get the counseling records?" Jameson hesitated. "Yeah, we got access to them. They were part of the church's records. But what's interesting is that Anne was seeing Paul separately, outside of the sessions with Jeremiah. Looks like they were meeting more than once a week for some personal counseling. I think we might have uncovered something that she didn't tell you." Lana felt a rush of adrenaline. "All right, get over here with those records. We need to see what they say. And Jameson, get me a copy of Paul Jackson's phone records. If there's anything unusual, I want to know about it." The officer agreed and promised to be there shortly. When Jameson arrived at the station, he was holding a thick file in his hands. Lana opened it eagerly, flipping through the counseling notes. The documents revealed that Anne had been seeing Paul on a more personal level than she had admitted. The sessions had started off as part of an effort to help her with the stress of managing her role as pastor's wife. But over time, the meetings had shifted. There were notes from Paul written in a tone that was eerily affectionate, suggesting an emotional closeness that didn't seem professional. Anne seemed troubled. She's withdrawn from her family, one of the entries read. She's trying to connect with her husband, but there's a palpable distance between them. She's been struggling with feelings of isolation. Lana frowned as she read the next few notes. Anne seems drawn to Paul's reassurance. She seems to be opening up more to him. I wonder if this is part of the emotional connection she's craving. The words on the pages felt heavy, like the silent thread between the two had been slowly weaving a dangerous bond. It wasn't hard to imagine how that closeness could have evolved into something more. But what kind of affair was this? Was it purely emotional, or had it crossed a physical line? Then she flipped to the last set of notes. They were dated just a week before Paul's death. The writing was more frantic now. I can't continue to meet with Anne like this, Paul had written. There's too much going on between us. I've already crossed the line of professional ethics, and I think Jeremiah suspects something. I don't want to be the reason their marriage falls apart, but I can't keep ignoring how I feel. Lana's blood ran cold. I can't keep ignoring how I feel. The words rang in her ears, and she felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. Was Paul Jackson about to end the affair, or had he decided to confront Jeremiah about it? And more importantly, was this the moment things had escalated into violence? Detective, you need to see this. Jameson's voice interrupted her thoughts. He handed her a printout of Paul Jackson's phone records, and Lana scanned the document quickly. The records showed several text messages between Paul and Anne, exchanged late the night before Paul's death. Most of the messages were vague, short and cryptic, but there was one that caught Lana's attention. Meet me in the church office. I need to talk, read Paul's final message to Anne. It had been sent just an hour before the time of death. Lana's heart skipped a beat. Anne had been at the church that night. She had left around the same time Paul had sent that message. It seemed like a clear invitation for a confrontation. But who had Paul intended to confront? Was it Anne, or was it Jeremiah? We need to speak with Anne again, Lana said, her voice low. There's more here than she's letting on, and we need to know exactly what happened in that office the night Paul was killed. Back at Anne's house, Lana didn't bother with pleasantries. The door opened slowly, and Anne's eyes widened as she saw Lana standing on the porch again. Detective Ross, what's this about? She asked, her voice shaky. Lana didn't waste time. You told me you and Paul were just friends, but the evidence says otherwise. You were meeting him outside of your sessions, and last night he sent you a message asking to meet him in the church office. What happened, Anne? Anne flinched at the mention of the message. She stood frozen for a long moment, her face pale. Finally, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a slow sigh. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want it to escalate, she whispered. I never meant for Jeremiah to find out. But Paul, he was getting too close. I couldn't stop him. Lana's voice softened, but she pressed on. What do you mean? What was going on between you two? Anne's eyes filled with tears. We never went all the way, Detective. But Paul, he made me feel seen again. He understood the weight I carried as Jeremiah's wife. He listened to me when no one else did. And then, things got complicated. I tried to push him away, but I couldn't. He told me he loved me, and I couldn't help how I felt about him. Lana's mind raced. And Jeremiah? Did he know? Anne shook her head, her lips trembling. He didn't, but he was suspicious. He had started watching me more closely. He knew something was off. Lana's thoughts were clear now. Did you meet Paul that night? Anne nodded, tears falling freely now. Yes, he wanted to talk. I went to the office, but I didn't know what he was going to say. When I arrived, Jeremiah was already there. He was holding the knife. Anne's confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jeremiah had known. He had confronted Paul that night, and the confrontation had turned into something far more violent. Lana felt the weight of everything coming into focus. The rage that had boiled over inside Jeremiah Wells had driven him to a horrific act of vengeance. But why had Anne lied? Why had she hidden the truth from Lana? Anne, you're not telling me everything, Lana said, her voice firm. Anne met her gaze broken and guilt-ridden. I'm sorry, she whispered, But I couldn't tell you the whole truth. Not yet. Lana's mind was working furiously. It wasn't over yet. There were still more pieces to uncover. But now at least, she had a clearer picture. Jeremiah Wells had killed Paul Jackson, but the roots of the murder were tangled deep in lies, deceit, and betrayal. And the final pieces of the puzzle were just within reach. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft tapping of Lana's fingers against her desk. She had learned over the years that every case, no matter how complex, had a point where the truth began to surface, a moment when the fog lifted just enough for her to see the path ahead. But this case, the murder of Paul Jackson, felt different. The deeper she dug, the more tangled the web of lies became. Ann Wells had finally admitted to meeting Paul Jackson the night of his death, and while Lana could see the guilt etched into Ann's face, something still didn't sit right. Why had Ann hidden the full truth for so long? What exactly had happened when she arrived at the church office that night? And why, despite everything, did it seem as though Ann was holding back, almost as if she were trying to protect someone? Lana's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She looked up to see Officer Jameson standing in the doorway, holding a thick folder in his hands. He looked serious, his brow furrowed, as if he were carrying some unsettling news. "Detective, we've just received some information that changes things," he said, stepping into the room and placing the folder on her desk. "It's about Jeremiah Wells." Lana raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" Jameson sat down across from her, pushing the folder toward her. "We've been digging into his past, looking for anything that could explain the extreme nature of his actions. And we found something." Lana opened the folder, flipping through the pages quickly. The first document that caught her eye was an old police report, dated back to when Jeremiah Wells had first moved to Atlanta. The report was vague, a brief note from a prior investigation, but there was one detail that immediately struck her. Jeremiah Wells was involved in a physical altercation with a man named Andrew Carter. She muttered to herself. "What is this about?" Jameson leaned forward. "We couldn't find much about Andrew Carter, but the report says that Wells was involved in a confrontation with him at a previous church he worked at in Tennessee. There was a mention of a family matter and violent behavior, but it was all buried under some legal terms. We contacted the old police department there, and they didn't have a full file on the incident. But the key detail is that this Andrew Carter disappeared after that confrontation." Lana's eyes narrowed. "So, he has a history of violence?" Jameson nodded. "It looks that way. It was never fully investigated, but it definitely raises questions. And there's more." He handed her another document. This one was an email printout between two church elders, discussing Jeremiah Wells's behavior in the past year. The content was shocking. "We've noticed a shift in Pastor Wells's demeanor," one of the emails read. "There's an air of possessiveness when it comes to Ann. He has become increasingly paranoid about her interactions with the congregation, particularly with Paul Jackson. We've seen him confront Paul several times after church services, and it's clear that something is off. His temper has been getting worse." Lana felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. Jeremiah's behavior hadn't been a sudden shift. It had been building for months. His possessiveness over Ann had escalated, and his suspicions about her relationship with Paul Jackson had festered into full-blown paranoia. And now that paranoia had culminated in a brutal act of violence. But if Jeremiah had these issues before, why didn't anyone act on it? Lana asked, more to herself than Jameson. Jameson paused. "Well, from what we've gathered, no one wanted to challenge him. He's the pastor. He's a respected figure in the community. A lot of people looked the other way." Lana's frustration was evident. But that doesn't explain why Ann lied. If Jeremiah had this history of anger and control, why would she try to cover for him? Jameson hesitated. "Maybe she's afraid of him. Maybe she feels trapped. From what I've seen, there's a pattern of control here, something deep and manipulative." Lana absorbed his words. "It doesn't make sense. Ann admitted that she was at the church that night. She admitted to meeting Paul. So why didn't she say something sooner about Jeremiah?" Jameson stood up, looking at her with concern. "Detective, I think Ann is scared, but I also think she might have known more about Jeremiah's intentions than she's letting on." Lana felt the weight of his words. This was the key, fear. Anne had been scared. But why? Was she afraid? Of what Jeremiah might do if she spoke the truth? Or was there something else, something darker, that she was trying to hide? The next morning, Lana returned to the Wells household. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important during her last visit, something that had been left unsaid. Anne answered the door, looking pale and worn, as though she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her posture was slumped, as if the weight of everything was beginning to crush her. Lana didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Anne's lips trembled as she stepped aside, allowing Lana to enter. "I've already told you everything, Detective," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Lana glanced around the living room, noticing the photographs of her family that adorned the walls. Smiling faces, perfect smiles, seemingly the ideal image of a family. But Lana knew better. Nothing was perfect here, not anymore. "Anne, I think you're holding back," Lana said, walking toward the couch and sitting down. "We've been digging into your husband's past. It looks like this behavior of his. It wasn't just a recent thing. Jeremiah has a history of anger, of controlling behavior. People have seen it before, and I think you've seen it too." Anne's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't speak. Lana's voice softened as she continued. "You don't have to protect him anymore. You don't have to hide what really happened. I need to understand why you lied to me about that night. What happened between you and Paul? And why was Jeremiah there when you arrived?" Anne trembled, her body shaking with a mixture of fear and grief. "I didn't want to lose him," she said quietly. "I didn't want to lose my family. I didn't want to admit to myself what was happening. When I met Paul that night, I thought we were just going to talk. But Jeremiah, he was already there. He was waiting for me." Lana leaned in, her gaze piercing. "And what happened when you arrived?" Anne closed her eyes as though trying to block out the memory. "Jeremiah was furious. He had a knife. He said that if anyone was going to have me, it would be him. He accused Paul of trying to take me from him. He told me he couldn't live without me. That's when it happened." Lana felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened, Anne?" Anne's voice cracked as she spoke. "Jeremiah, he killed him, Detective. He killed Paul, and he made me promise that I wouldn't tell anyone. He said if I did, he would destroy me and my children." Lana's heart pounded in her chest. The truth was finally coming to light, but it was far worse than she had imagined. Jeremiah had murdered Paul Jackson, but he had done it in the most cruel and manipulative way possible. He had used Anne's love and fear against her, ensuring her silence with threats of violence against their family. Lana stood up slowly, feeling a surge of anger and sympathy for Anne. "This is over, Anne. You don't have to protect him anymore. I'll make sure he pays for what he did." Anne's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." Lana nodded solemnly. "I know." The investigation had taken a dark turn, and Lana now knew the full extent of Jeremiah Wells's actions. He had murdered Paul Jackson in a fit of jealous rage, but it wasn't just about the affair. It was about control, about power, about using his wife as a pawn in a twisted game. The truth was now clear. Jeremiah Wells was not the man the community thought he was. He was a monster hiding behind the veil of a pastor's robe. But now it was time to ensure that justice was served. No more lies, no more manipulation. Jeremiah Wells would be held accountable for his actions, no matter how far he had gone to keep his secrets buried. The morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Lana's office, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk. The investigation into Paul Jackson's murder had taken an unexpected turn, one that Lana knew would lead to a bitter, final confrontation. Jeremiah Wells, the respected pastor of a well-known Atlanta church, was about to be revealed as a killer. But the question remained, would the community ever believe it? Would they be able to accept the truth about the man they had trusted for so long? Lana hadn't felt this kind of tension since her earlier days on the force, when the stakes were higher and the players more dangerous. But this felt different. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about exposing the hypocrisy of someone who had used religion as a veil for control, manipulation, and violence. The weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. She ran a hand through her hair, leaning back in her chair. Ann Wells's confession had unraveled the mystery of what happened that night. Jeremiah's violent nature was now exposed, but Lana had one more step to take before it was all over. She needed to confront Jeremiah himself. Later that afternoon, Lana sat in her car, parked just a few blocks from the church. The large, imposing building loomed before her, the bells ringing in the distance. From the outside, it seemed almost too pristine, a sharp contrast to the darkness that had been brewing inside for years. Lana's hands gripped the steering wheel as she surveyed the church parking lot. It was empty now, except for a few cars, parked in rows like sentinels standing guard. This was it, the final confrontation. Lana had already prepared her team. They were waiting outside the church, ready to move in at the right moment. But she had to be the one to speak with Jeremiah first. She had to make sure the truth came from his lips. She wasn't sure if he'd confess easily, or if he'd lie and deny everything, even as the evidence stacked against him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Officer Jameson. "Jeremiah is at the church now. He's in his office. We're ready when you are." Lana took a deep breath. She felt a cold determination rise within her. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about making sure Jeremiah couldn't hide behind the facade of a man of God. He had to face what he'd done, and it had to happen now. The church was quiet when Lana walked through the front doors. The air was thick with the smell of incense, the kind of smell that had once been comforting to her, reminding her of community and solace. Now it felt hollow. The church, once a place of refuge, had become a prison of lies. As Lana walked down the long hallway, her footsteps echoed off the marble floors. She could hear the low murmur of voices ahead, and as she neared the pastor's office, the voices grew louder. She took a moment to steady herself, breathing in and out slowly. She had to keep her focus. The past few days had taken a toll on her, but now was not the time for weakness. She knocked on the door to Jeremiah Wells' office, and after a brief silence, the voice from inside called out, "Come in." Lana opened the door and stepped inside. Jeremiah was sitting behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him as if in prayer. He looked up with a calm, collected expression, his face betraying no hint of the anger that Lana had expected. "Detective Ross," he said smoothly, his voice warm but carefully measured. "What brings you here today? I assume this is about my wife. I understand that there are some rumors circulating. I'm not surprised, unfortunately. People like to talk." Lana's eyes narrowed. His calmness unnerved her. She had expected to find him anxious, perhaps defensive, but he was too composed, like a man who was already in control of the situation. She took a step forward, her voice firm but steady. "We need to talk about Paul Jackson," she said, watching for any reaction. Jeremiah's face didn't change, but his eyes flickered for a moment, just long enough for Lana to catch it. A slight crack in the armor. He was listening, but was he listening because he was worried? Or because he knew exactly what was coming? "I've already told you everything I know about Paul," he said, his voice calm and collected. "He was a troubled man, a man who couldn't handle the pressure of his position. I tried to help him, but he was lost." Lana didn't buy it. "I don't think that's all there is to it, Pastor Wells. In fact, I think you know exactly what happened between you and Paul Jackson the night he was murdered." Jeremiah's eyes remained locked on her, but there was a tension in his jaw now, a tightening that Lana could see. He knew she was getting closer to the truth. "I don't know what you're implying, Detective," he said, his voice still smooth but with a slight edge now. "I didn't murder anyone." Lana didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, her voice low. "You did, though. You killed him, Jeremiah. You killed Paul because of your jealousy, because of your anger. And I'm here to make sure you pay for it." Jeremiah's eyes darkened. The calmness he had shown earlier began to crack, and for a moment he looked like a man who knew his life was about to crumble. But his next words came out like poison. "You think you know everything, don't you, Detective?" His voice was low and dangerous now. "You think that you can come in here, dig through my life, and bring me down with your little games? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Lana stood her ground, not letting the anger in his voice shake her. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Jeremiah. I know about your past, about the violence you've hidden for years. I know about the way you manipulated your wife, the way you controlled her, used her fear to make sure she stayed silent. And I know you killed Paul Jackson because you couldn't control him." Jeremiah's fist clenched on the desk, his knuckles turning white. His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "You don't know anything about me. You think you understand my life, my ministry, but you're just a pawn in a game you don't even know you're playing." Lana didn't back down. She had seen men like him before. Men who used power and influence to protect their lies, their secrets. Men who thought they could get away with anything because they wore the right masks. But this was different. Jeremiah Wells wasn't going to get away with it. "You're right about one thing," Lana said, her voice cold and steady. "You're playing a game, but this time you're not the one holding the cards. I am, and you're going to pay for what you did." Jeremiah stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back, his face flushed with rage. "I didn't do it. You can't prove a thing." Lana didn't flinch. "We don't need to prove anything anymore, Jeremiah. The truth is already out. We know about your meetings with Paul. We know about your violent tendencies. We know you confronted him that night in the church office and ended his life. And we know you threatened your wife into silence." Jeremiah took a step forward, his eyes wild now. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Do you think you can just waltz in here, destroy my life, and walk away unscathed? I'm the pastor of this church, detective. You think I don't have people who will protect me? You think I won't make sure you regret this?" Lana's voice was sharp. "You're not above the law, Jeremiah. You're going down for this, and no amount of threats or power can change that." There was a long, tense silence. Then finally Jeremiah collapsed into his chair, his face drained of color, his earlier anger dissipating. The fight had gone out of him. "You think I did it, don't you?" he whispered, more to himself than to Lana. Lana nodded slowly, watching as the mask fell away completely. "Yes, I do, and it's time for you to face the consequences." The door opened behind Lana, and Officer Jameson stepped into the room. He was followed by two other officers, their presence a reminder that the game was over. Jeremiah Wells was finally going to pay for the murder he had committed, and the truth was finally out in the open. As the officers moved to arrest him, Lana couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the lies, and brought a killer to justice. But more than that, she had brought an end to the silence that had shielded him for so long. The pastor's reign of terror was over. The air outside the church was thick with tension, the weight of the past few days hanging heavy in the atmosphere. Officer Jameson had secured Jeremiah Wells in handcuffs, leading him out of the church and into the back of a squad car. The community that had once revered him as a beacon of faith now stood in shocked silence, watching as the man who had preached the word of God was led away, his life unraveling before their eyes. Lana stood at the entrance of the church, her eyes trained on the officers escorting Jeremiah. She had been through many arrests in her career, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a criminal. This was a man who had manipulated an entire congregation, hiding his true nature behind the pulpit. And now the mask was finally slipping, exposing the monster beneath. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find Jameson standing beside her, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Detective," he began, his voice low. "It's finally over. He's in custody." Lana nodded but didn't respond immediately. She was still processing everything: the confession, the unraveling of a life built on lies, and the fallout that would ripple through the community. Pastor Wells's arrest would be all over the news by the evening, and soon people would know the truth about the man they had trusted. "Are we ready to move forward with the charges?" Lana asked, her tone steady but firm. Jameson sighed. "We've got enough to charge him with murder. We'll be filing the official charges soon. But there's more to this case, Detective. A lot more." Lana raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jameson glanced around, as though ensuring no one was listening. "Anne, there's something off about her story. We've been digging into her past a little more, and we found something strange. Before she moved to Atlanta with Jeremiah, she was involved in a domestic violence case in another state. It was all sealed, but the details are murky. Something doesn't add up." Lana felt a chill run through her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet," Jameson replied, shaking his head. But it's worth looking into. There may be more to Anne's involvement in this than we initially thought. Lana stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been so focused on bringing Jeremiah to justice that she hadn't stopped to consider the full extent of Anne's role. Anne had lied. Yes, but what if there was more to her story? What if she had been complicit in something even darker than what they had uncovered? The investigation took a new turn that afternoon. Lana, with Jameson at her side, headed to the address they had tracked down for Ann Wells. They were prepared for a difficult conversation, one that could potentially change the course of everything they had learned about the case. Anne answered the door, her face pale and tired, as if the last few days had drained the life out of her. She seemed surprised to see Lana standing there, her eyes darting to the officer beside her. "Detective Ross," Anne said softly, her voice trembling. "I've already told you everything I know." Lana didn't waste any time. "Anne, we need to talk about your past. We found something that could change everything. I need you to be honest with me. No more lies." Anne hesitated, her hand gripping the doorknob as though she was considering whether to shut the door on them. After a long pause, she sighed and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. As they sat down, Lana noticed the photographs of Anne's family hanging on the walls. There were pictures of her children, smiling, carefree, reminders of a life that seemed far removed from the dark reality Anne had been living in. Anne finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to bring that up. I didn't want anyone to know about it. It's something I've tried to forget." Lana leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Anne's. "You don't have to keep protecting him, Anne. You're free from him now, but you need to tell me everything. The truth about what really happened." Anne's face crumpled and tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Before I met Jeremiah, I was married to someone else. His name was Adam. We had a beautiful life in Charleston, but it didn't last. He was abusive, he was controlling, and it got worse after we had our son. He would hit me, keep me isolated, make me feel like I was worthless. I didn't know how to get away from him." Lana's heart tightened as Anne spoke. It wasn't hard to imagine what she had gone through, but hearing the words come from her mouth was different. It was a raw confession, a woman finally releasing the weight of a painful past. "I tried to leave, but he always found me," Anne continued. "He threatened to take our son away from me if I left. So I stayed. I stayed because I was scared. And then I met Jeremiah. He was different. He was kind, and he promised me he could give me a new life. I thought he was my savior." Lana nodded, understanding the desperation in Anne's voice. "But that life wasn't what you thought it would be, was it?" Anne shook her head, her sobs deepening. "Number. At first, he was everything I wanted, but over time, he became just like Adam. He became controlling, possessive. He started isolating me again, keeping me away from my family, my friends. He told me that I was his, that I belonged to him. And when Paul came into the picture, it triggered something in him. He couldn't handle the idea of losing me, and that's when everything spiraled." Lana felt a pit form in her stomach as Anne's story unfolded. This wasn't just a case of a woman caught between two men. This was the story of a woman who had been trapped in a cycle of abuse and control for years, first by her husband and then by the man who was supposed to save her. "But you lied about that night, Anne," Lana said gently. "You could have told me everything. You could have stopped this from happening." Anne's eyes filled with shame. "I was scared, Detective. Scared of what Jeremiah might do if I told the truth. He made me promise that I would never tell anyone what happened that night. He said he would destroy me, destroy my children. I didn't know how to get out. I thought if I just kept quiet, I could protect them." Lana reached out, placing a hand on Anne's shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Jeremiah can't hurt you. He's in custody now, and you're safe." Anne nodded, her tears still flowing freely. "I should have told you earlier. I should have told someone." Lana stood up, giving Anne one last comforting look before turning toward the door. "You're not the one at fault here, Anne. You've been through too much. But now it's time for you to be free from all of this." The news of Jeremiah Wells's arrest spread like wildfire. By the evening, it was all over the local news. The pastor of a beloved Atlanta church had been arrested for the brutal murder of a church member, and the shocking revelations of his violent and manipulative behavior were broadcast to an audience that had once worshipped him. The fallout was immediate. Congregants who had once seen Jeremiah as a spiritual leader now grappled with the reality of his actions. They were left to question everything they had been taught, to wonder how they could have been so blind to the man behind the pulpit. The community was shaken to its core. But as the dust began to settle, Lana knew that this case was far from over. Jeremiah's arrest was only the beginning. The damage he had caused, not just to Paul Jackson and Ann Wells, but to everyone who had trusted him, would take much longer to heal. And for Lana, the work wasn't done. The investigation was still ongoing, with more questions left to answer. What other dark secrets did Jeremiah have hidden in his past? What had driven him to this point of violence and betrayal? But one thing was certain: justice had been served, and the truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light. The courtroom was quiet as the jury filed in, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Outside, the streets of Atlanta buzzed with activity, the world moving on as if nothing had changed. But for the small group of people gathered in the courthouse, the world had shifted forever. Lana Ross sat at the back of the courtroom, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the proceedings. It had been months since the arrest of Jeremiah Wells, and now the trial was nearing its end. She had followed every moment of the case, witnessing the unraveling of a man who had once been regarded as a beacon of faith and community leadership. But in the end, it was all a lie. As the judge called for order, Lana took a deep breath, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The murder of Paul Jackson had been only the beginning. It had uncovered a labyrinth of lies, manipulation, and abuse that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. The defense team had tried to paint a different picture of Jeremiah, one of a misunderstood man, a leader pushed to the edge by betrayal and violence in his past. But the evidence had been undeniable. The testimony of Ann Wells, the recorded confession, and the sheer weight of the circumstances had proven that Jeremiah's descent into violence was not a result of some singular event. It had been the culmination of years of control, anger, and deceit. Lana had known from the moment she walked into his office that he was a dangerous man, but seeing the full extent of his manipulation, especially over Ann, had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Ann, woman who had once been trapped in an abusive marriage and had sought refuge in Jeremiah's arms, had found herself once again imprisoned, not by physical chains, but by the psychological hold Jeremiah had over her. But now, as the trial came to its conclusion, it was clear that the truth had come to light. Jeremiah Wells was not just a murderer. He was a man who had used faith, power, and control to create a world of fear and secrecy, and now he would face the consequences. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours, but when they finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lana's gaze locked onto Ann, who sat quietly in the front row, her eyes red and swollen from weeks of stress and anxiety. But there was something else in her expression now, something that Lana had not seen before. It was a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden was beginning to lift from her shoulders. The jury foreman stood, his voice clear as he addressed the court. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jeremiah Wells, guilty of first-degree murder." The words echoed in Lana's mind, and for the first time since the beginning of the case, she allowed herself to exhale. It was over. The justice that Paul Jackson and his family deserved had finally been served. The man who had destroyed so many lives, including Ann's, would now face the consequences of his actions. The weeks that followed were a blur for Lana. The media had moved on, the story of Pastor Wells's arrest and conviction slowly fading from the headlines as new stories took their place. But for those who had been affected by Jeremiah's actions, the healing process was just beginning. Ann Wells, now free from her husband's grip, had taken her children and moved to a new town, far away from the place where her life had been shattered. Lana had stayed in touch with her, offering support and encouraging her to take the time she needed to rebuild her life. Ann had asked if she could ever make up for the mistakes she had made, and Lana had told her the same thing she had told herself for years. Healing wasn't about fixing everything in the past. It was about moving forward and finding peace, even after the storm. For Lana, the case had brought more than just a sense of justice. It had also forced her to reflect on her own life, her own choices. She had spent years chasing the truth, but this case had shown her the cost of uncovering those truths. Sometimes the truth was more painful than the lies it replaced. She thought about the people she had lost along the way, the friendships strained by long hours and late nights, and the relationships she had neglected in her pursuit of justice. She thought about her own family, her mother, who had died too young, and her estranged father, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. The case had made her realize how much she had been consumed by her work, how much of her life had been spent chasing after answers for everyone else, while her own life had quietly slipped away. But that realization, too, was a form of redemption. Lana didn't need to solve every case, to catch every criminal, to bring justice to every victim. What she needed was balance. What she needed was peace. On a crisp morning a few weeks after the trial, Lana found herself walking down the streets of downtown Atlanta, the city she had called home for so many years. The early morning sunlight cast a warm glow on the buildings, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. She wasn't sure what the future held for her, but she knew that she was ready to face it. She passed by a small park where a group of children played, their laughter filling the air. She watched them for a moment, then turned to walk toward a small cafe on the corner. As she stepped inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted her, and she smiled, taking a seat at a table by the window. As she sat there sipping her coffee and watching the world go by, Lana's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text message from Jameson. "We're closing the case file today. I know you've already moved on, but I just wanted to thank you for everything. You made a difference. We all did." Lana smiled, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. She wasn't alone in this. There had been a team behind her, each one working tirelessly to uncover the truth. And while Jeremiah Wells' conviction had been the end of one chapter, it was only the beginning of the next, for her, for Anne, and for everyone affected by the lies he had told. Lana took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It was time to let go of the past, to stop chasing after ghosts, and to embrace the future. For the first time in a long while, Lana Ross felt free. The sound of church bells echoed through the streets of Atlanta, their chimes ringing out in the distance. And for the first time, Lana didn't hear them as a symbol of something that had been corrupted. Instead, she heard them as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be redemption. There could be healing. The end of one chapter, she realized, was always the beginning of another, and it was time for her to turn the page.